Hi everybody and welcome to the Wessex Archaeology webinar this afternoon. Thanks for joining. So before we start, what I'll do is just introduce your speakers today. So my name is Maddie Gilbert. I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager at Wessex Archaeology, and I'll be facilitating this webinar for you. And then shortly I will hand over to Jackie McKinley, and Jackie's your speaker today, and she'll be talking all about her work on a sarcophagus excavated on Amesbury Down. But before I do, what I'll do is just give a little bit of a brief introduction about Wessex Archaeology, who we are and what we do, just in case you might not be aware. So we're an archaeology and heritage company, and we're also an educational charity. Now, as a commercial company, what we do is we help our customers to manage the impacts of change or development on the historic environment. And the majority of this is what's usually ahead of development. So any building work like a new housing estate or a railway or a wind farm offshore might be developed. Our experts go in and investigate the archaeology and the heritage of that site. And we record and analyse what we find, and then we make sure that all of that information is made freely available to the local community and the general public in lots of different ways. So we produce reports and books, but we also do a lot of kind of community engagement, and also it allows us to do some really lovely things like this webinar today. As you can see from the images, we work in a huge variety of environments. It's not just digging holes in the ground, it's also working in coastal environments, underwater, rivers, also with historic buildings. You can see a beautiful, beautiful building top right, that picture. We have lots of different experts who help us do different things, from analysing environmental remains to what Jackie does, and our specialists that look at human bones and things like that. And as an educational charity, really community engagement is at the heart of what we do. So it means we can work with local communities and with schools up and down the country, and we help to connect people with their past, and we use archaeology as the tool for doing that. So we educate people in wider subjects like culture, heritage, technology, science, and we use archaeology in the past to do that. So that is us in a nutshell. So that is all from me. Without further ado, I will hand over to Jackie. Jackie, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. Right, I will hand over to you now.
Right. Good morning. Oh, should I say good afternoon, everybody? This is a bit weird for me because I'm just talking to a computer screen, which feels rather strange. But at least I can see I'm not just talking to myself, which would be even stranger. Now, the title of this talk today, the Amesbury Down Flesh Eater, is a bit sort of tabloid headline, and it's the kind of thing I would avoid like the plague normally, because I work with human remains all the time. It's nothing unusual, and I don't think there's anything weird or spooky or ghoulish about it. But for those of you who have some understanding of ancient Greek, you might understand why I've used this rather hammer horror phrase, flesh eater, here, because that is what the word sarcophagus translates to be as. It translates as flesh eater. This does make one wonder what the ancient Greeks were doing, whether they were sort of having a look to see whether the flesh had been eaten inside these sarcophagi or not. But anyway, that's what they called them. And in our case, this one here that we had from Amesbury Down, it didn't actually do the bone a great deal of good either. Not just the flesh went, but other things went as well. Now, this wasn't anticipated. This find wasn't anticipated at Amesbury Down. I've been working in archaeology and osteoarchaeology for several decades now, and this was the first time that I'd come across the sarcophagus in my personal experience. Oddly enough, this particular, it's a bit like waiting for a bus. Oddly enough, this year we actually had two turn up, but this really was the most interesting. They're not very common. There are about 200 Romano-British examples from the British Isles, most of them in the 19th century, antiquarian finds, and also from the earlier 20th century. So there's not an awful lot of them being excavated under modern archaeological conditions. There are clusters of them from Cambridge and Gloucestershire, particularly Cirencester. There's a few from Somerset. There's also numerous finds from York and London. And Poundbury in Dorset had more than 11. In other words, what you tended to do is get concentrations of these types of deposits in urban areas, which is what you might expect because that is where people might have been more wealthy. But with about 10 rural singletons from Wiltshire, 4 of them from Bradford and Avon. Most are of limestone, are constructed from limestone, except for the brave souls in York who had millstone grit. I suspect that's because there's not a lot of limestone and you're near the millstone grit from the Pennines there. So it's likely to be the location would affect what type of stone you would use, but most of the examples that we do find are of limestone. So why were we excavating here? Okay. We've been excavating at Amesbury Down in Wiltshire. For those of you who live in Wiltshire or around Wiltshire, you'll know Amesbury Down is just to the north of Salisbury. It's just, well, Stonehenge is almost next door to it, or rather, should I say, it's almost next door to Stonehenge. And over recent years, anybody who's driven in to Salisbury from Amesbury on that main road will notice there has been a very, very large housing development. And it's not unusual for housing developments all over the country to be why we end up excavating cemeteries or isolated burials. I did a survey some years ago now of all the cemeteries that have been excavated in within a 5-year period, and 85% of them were in advance of housing development. So it isn't that we just go out there and think, oh, there's a nice cemetery, we'll go and dig that. We do this kind of work in advance of development, and the remains would be destroyed and badly disturbed if we didn't excavate them in advance. This has been going on, this site that we've been working on here at Amesbury Down has run over a 25-year period. So that's quite a lot of my career time at Wessex Archaeology. We started with you can see here, I put up a slide of the cemeteries that we've got here. So we started over on the east with cemeteries 1 and 2 when I was quite a young, slim young woman, which I'm afraid I'm not anymore. And we slowly worked our way westward. This is as that different parts of the housing development scheme came into being. Obviously, they don't tend to build big housing developments like this all at one go, and different parts of it are built at different times. And in fact, the last bit of this housing development doesn't feature on this particular screen because you can see we had in total 8 cemeteries. They varied dramatically in size from very small ones like this one at Cemetery 8 here that only had about, I think that was 4 graves that we had there, to Cemetery 7, which was the largest of our cemeteries here, which had over 200 graves in it. But there are also isolated graves. You can see the little isolated graves dotted to the south and a few to the north. And we did have one about here. There was another isolated grave that came out over at the very west end last year, and that was the isolated grave of a young child, a female child. So this has been going on for quite a long time now. The cemetery that we're going to focus on will be Cemetery 7, but if you look here, you can see the cemeteries do have slightly different forms. I'm not going to go through these in detail because that would be an entire lecture all on its own, but you can see some of them have got these little enclosures around them. You can see there's an enclosure in Cemetery 3, there's an enclosure in Cemetery 5, there's a very small enclosure in Cemetery 6, which you can only see a small bit of, and then in Cemetery 7 there are 2 enclosures. We'll see this on the next slide a little bit clearer. These cemeteries were all in use at the same time. They may have started, some started a little bit earlier than others, some started probably in the latter part of the early Roman phase, so we're talking about 2nd century AD, but most of them tend to be mid to late Roman, so we're going into the 3rd, 4th century there. Right, so Cemetery 7. So that was the largest of the cemeteries that we looked at on the big screen there. And you can see here we have these two enclosures. So we've got a plan of the cemetery, but also a view looking down on the cemetery at the two enclosures. So this is one of your enclosures here, and this is your second enclosure here. And this is the grave on which we will be focusing. A point of interest here, you can see this is where the houses were being built. That's how close they were to us. And this, I'm hoping you can see where I'm showing my arrow, is the route of one of the roads. And that more or less would have gone straight across this grave. These two enclosures were really quite important, especially this one here, because this looks to be where the cemetery originated from. This appears to be the focus of this particular cemetery. Who are using these cemeteries is obviously a question that we debate at some length in archaeology. Why were the different cemeteries all being used at the same time? There is a settlement to the north of this site. So if I just go back a minute to this, there was a settlement here, and you can see these ditches. Well, it's a ditch, but also it's a hollow way. So there was a route way probably going back up here to this settlement here. The settlement probably extended both to the east and to the west. There was no evidence for settlement to the south of this ditch here. Now this is referred to as a Wessex linear ditch. This is actually a prehistoric monument, but it was used by the Romans to distinguish between what we called the area of the living and the area of the dead to the south. So why people were burying in slightly different areas? Well, it could be that these two cemeteries over here were functioning for people who were on the outskirts of the settlement area. It could be some of the smaller cemeteries were related to certain households within the settlement, or it could be, given that this is a upslope, this area here is upslope, and we're looking down across the downs to the west, south and west of Amesbury here, Amesbury itself being up to the northwest. And it could be that we've got settlements, maybe villas or something like that we don't yet know about, that were in the viewshed of this area, that also using areas up here in which to bury their dead. So moving back to Cemetery 7, this enclosure, as I say, does seem to have been the focus, and this burial is likely to have been the focus of this particular cemetery development. We can see this partly because many of these graves, although they're on different orientations, when you look at them, many of the graves are orientated on the same alignment as the enclosure. There was something about that orientation of both the grave within the enclosure and the enclosure itself, which acted as a focus for many of the other burials, which were either set on the same alignment or perpendicular to it. This is just showing you this in detail. You can see the layout in the grave here. What you will notice about this enclosure is that there is no entrance to it. This was about 1.5 meters deep and about 2 meters wide. We've lost some of the width of this because of truncation, horizontal truncation over time. But the chances are that given its width and its depth, and what we will find out about the sarcophagus a little bit later, that the grave was inserted first and then the enclosure was put in around it. We weren't anticipating finding the sarcophagus. This just looked like another grave. It was quite a large grave, but nonetheless, we weren't anticipating what we would find. And this was our initial view, a large slab of stone that showed up in that initial cleaning, which when exposed demonstrated that we had a coffin that was lidded. You'll see that there are some gaps here. There's a gap down this end, the upside end, and there's a small gap here. Now, what this looks like when we look at this a little bit later on, you'll see is that these capstones, which is what they are, were not actually made for this particular sarcophagus. Why that should have been the case is not clear, but what we've got is two different lumps of stone. They are shaped around the edges to fit over the lip. You can see there's a lip here. They've been shaped to fit over the lip of the coffin. Unfortunately, what we can see is that they were placed the wrong way round, and there are two different stones that did not go together. So this looks like whether somebody got a cheap job lot, or whether they dropped the lid on the way there, on the way to the cemetery from where the lids themselves had been quarried out and suddenly had to make a replacement. We're not really very sure, but we'll look into that in a little bit of detail later on. But this kind of thing makes the work that we do so human, because you can almost see them thinking, oh my goodness me, you know, what we're going to do here, it doesn't quite fit, we haven't got it quite in the right place. I mean, that's the other thing, they hadn't got it quite in the right place. They'd left a bit of a gap here and an overhang at this end. But this main lid weighed 1,000 kilograms. So I mean, we needed modern lifting gear to get this in here, modern lifting gear, and we had to widen the grave in order to get that modern lifting gear in here. Now, what this demonstrates to you is what a job this would have been for the Romans who put this in the ground. This was one heck of a piece of mechanical and technological work that they did here to get this into the ground without dropping it. There was a little gap, as you can see, and that's where we got our first view of what was inside the coffin. The logistics of lifting, as I said, we actually needed to have this modern lifting gear, and you can see how difficult that was for us to get the material in there and get that big machine to lift that out from us, which I think demonstrates really well, like I said, how difficult it would have been for the Romans and how they really were. They really did know what they were doing when they were handling heavy materials like this. They would have had the engineering skills in order to get this in place, hopefully without trapping anybody's fingers or dropping anything on anybody's head. The initial view we had, as I said, was through the little gap. This was actually the initial view that we had of it, and this was the view we had when the lid came off. No soil had got in here apart from a very small amount that got in to either end through those gaps that we saw. And I must confess, when I first saw this, it just looked like a lot of brown gloop, really. And I really did think, oh crikey, what on earth am I going to do with this lot? Because I couldn't really see immediately what I was looking at. You had to sort of stop, think about it, and look. And once you'd started with that methodical approach, your eye started to adjust to what it was we could see here. And as we started the excavation, it started to make sense. But of course, the first thing we had to do was photograph absolutely everything, which is what you can see my colleague doing here. We're photographing everything, we're recording everything before we start doing any further work on this. Beyond that, we started to do the excavation itself. And we did this by first of all taking out some of the gloop that was around the bone. But as I said, what we could see, we planned in detail, and you might have to believe me when this is the initial site plan, which is why it looks a little bit sad. But what we could see when we started to look at this, there were parts of two individuals in here. There's a skull here, and there's another skull over here. There was a vessel up by the head of one individual and a set of beads. There were shoes here and here, and a silver anklet, and as I say, a lot of brown sludge. So how do we make sense of that? How does it start to look a little bit more realistic? The reason we had got such fantastic finds, and we did get fantastic finds, was because of the environment within this sarcophagus. The bone itself, sadly, had not survived terrifically well, which is why it's not obvious what you're looking at. But what we did have in its place was a fantastic preservation of the organic materials that were in there. We had quite a lot of soft tissue remains, and we had the remains of organic materials, including leather. This is just to demonstrate how we have to do, each item has to be individually recorded and lifted. So they're 3D recorded, their height, their location. They each are giving individual numbers as they're lifted, and their position in the grave is recorded both by hand and digitally. We systematically removed the sludge within here. It's not very exciting visually, but we did it in blocks and spits, and that was in order to make sure that I could reveal the skeletal elements, but also there may be materials in that sort of brown sludgy material that would help us understand what other organic remains were in this coffin. So that we knew exactly where they were in position in relationship to the bone that we had in there, they were taken out in, as you can see, a series of blocks down here, down each side. It wasn't actually very thick. That material was only about 33 centimeters deep, so 30 millimeters. Sorry, I'm working in millimeters and centimeters here. It was 3 centimeters deep, so it's not very thick because there was not a lot of soil had got in there. There was just little bits of silting that had got in. So mostly what we had, and I know it sounds horrible, but you know, the brown sludgy stuff would originally have been things like the organic materials in the base of there, mixed with the body liquors that, as the body decomposed, they would have created a very acid environment that helped preserve those organic remains. If I move on to the next slide, hopefully now you can see the human remains turning up. They're not particularly well preserved, but there is a skull of an adult individual here. That's the spine going down here. Her hips, the leg, the knee, down the legs to the feet. She's been laid in this coffin on her left side, facing a child. The child's remains are a skull here. You can see ribs going off here. There's little bits of the spine. It's not particularly well preserved. And then down to the legs and the feet. So the child's feet were resting on her lower thigh around her knee. So the skeletal remains are not particularly well preserved, but they were well enough preserved for me to be able to do some aging and sexing of the individuals, which I'll come on to shortly. But what we had is a male child of about 4 to 5 years of age. Now I can age the child. Usually aging is done from the teeth are very useful for aging because they develop at a set rate, plus or minus 6 months or so, depending on males and females. But your deciduous teeth develop at a more or less set rate. They erupt more or less within a set period. The eruption is not as robust a way of aging as the development itself. And then, of course, your permanent dentition also develops at a fairly set rate. What I can't do is I cannot readily sex a child. Sorry, I've gone on to the next one. I cannot readily sex children because children do not, until you sort of reach puberty and you start to develop the sexual dimorphism of the skeleton starts to develop more. It's very difficult to sex a child. I had actually suggested that this would be a male child, but this got confirmed by a new type of scientific analysis that's been developed in the last couple of years called peptide analysis. And this is but it's not very destructive, which is one of the problems with a lot of the kinds of specialist scientific analysis that we can do, is it can be quite destructive. But in this case, all it is a very small sample that is taken of the tooth enamel, and the peptides within the tooth enamel are will reflect the sex of the individual. So in this case, that did confirm that we did have a male child, and he was lying on his right side facing the adult female. The adult female was about 24, 28 years of age. It's harder to age adults because what you're doing when you're aging individuals is going from the tooth development, but also the skeletal development. And the last of those bone fusions, it's to do when your skeleton's developing, you have growing ends of bones that allow the bone to extend in size, and they tend to fuse and become a single bone when you reach a certain age. So, for instance, if we think about your femur, that's your thigh bone, you have a distal end, the knee end, which is separated from the long bone shaft, and you have three what we call centers of ossification at the hip end. There's your hip joint itself, the ball joint, and then you've got two other small centers of ossification, two epiphyses that are where you have large muscle attachments which go at the top end of the femur as well, and they will fuse to form one bone, the whole bone as one thing, within set parameters. The last of those fusions takes place when you're between the age of about 25 and 29, and that's in the medial side, that's the inner side of your collarbone or your clavicle. So if there's anybody there who's not yet 25 years of age, you probably haven't finished fusing, and your skeleton is still developing. Once you get beyond the point where your skeleton has finished developing, unfortunately, you start to deteriorate, and we have to go on degenerative changes. But fortunately, this particular female had not got fusion of certain areas of her skeleton, so I could age her fairly closely. She was laid on her left side facing the child. Her left arm went under the child and the right arm was laid over his body. So basically, the child had been laid in the coffin in her arms. The picture this paints is really very real, very human. The chances are this coffin, because it was so heavy, you could not risk the individuals being in the coffin when it was placed in the ground. So the chances are the coffin was in the ground already before these two individuals were placed within there. So they were laid within the coffin in that position, together in death, as they probably had been together in life, which can be seen as quite sad in ways, but also quite heartening that they were able to spend the rest of eternity together. I'm going to look now at some of the finds that came out with these individuals. We had a lot of traded goods that demonstrated there'd been long distances travelled. There was a lot of expense involved in this. And if we look at where these were placed, we saw them roughly in the photographs, which didn't come out terribly clearly. And hopefully now these are the drawn up plans that we have, so you can see better how that female is laid. She's the unshaded skeleton there, and then the shaded skeleton is that of the young boy who was placed next to her. You will see there is that's where one of the vessels was placed. That's a close-up of the vessels and the jet bead necklace that was placed around it. The jet beads weren't actually placed around either of these individuals' neck. They were placed around that vessel. You'll also notice there were a pair of shoes outside. We didn't have the whole shoes, but what we do have is the hobnails arranged as they were here. Hobnailed shoes are one of the more common kinds of footwear that we find. Not all footwear would have had hobnails, and she actually had another set of footwear, which you can see here. I'm going to show you more in detail because this was shortly, because this was one of the most exciting things for me that we found. But the fact that she had a spare pair of shoes outside, because they would have been to fit her, not him, is really quite interesting. You do sometimes in the Roman period get this kind of spare pair. Spare pairs of shoes going in because the pair she was wearing did not have hobnails on them. And this is really to help on the journey in the afterlife. That's what they're there for. That they were placed outside the coffin, not inside the coffin, is intriguing. Why that should have been the case, I'm not entirely clear. But it's one of the questions that my colleagues who are more au fait with finds and what those finds mean will be looking into in more detail. So we can see how she's laid out and the child is laid out, and we can see that there's footwear down here, and this is the child's footwear. This was her footwear, and we're not really quite sure what this item here was. It's possible that it might have been, we thought at first it was leather work that was around her leg, but we think now it could actually be part of a pillow that might have been in the coffin with her. But I'll come back onto that a little bit more later. But while I've got this slide up here, I want to show you about the coffin structure itself. Now, what you can see here, this is the upper lip of the coffin itself going around here. The slightly darker line here is the outer lip of the coffin. So it was lipped, and then this is the sort of body of the coffin itself. You can see how misplaced those two capstones were on the second of the slides here. That is the larger of the capstones, which, as you can see, wasn't actually over the end, the apsidal end, head end of the coffin at all. And the second capstone, which actually didn't even match the large one, as overhanging quite badly on this side here. And we'll look at that a little bit later when we talk about the coffin, but I think it's interesting for you to be able to see how that was arranged on the main bit of the coffin. So the finds, as I said, we had traded goods. We've got an imported vessel. This is the little drinking beaker, little drinking cup, which came from Alsace or Trier, and it's mid-3rd century in date. We've got Whitby jet. These are very high status items that we've got in this coffin with this woman and this child. This globular bodied beaker, because sometimes you get in what we call indented beakers, but this is a globular bodied beaker, is an import. It's relatively common for an import, but it's rarely found in graves. And this might be just a fashion of the day. It's something to do with fashion rather than anything specific. Whitby jet is actually quite rare in southern England. Generally, we get items made of shale round here, if we get such items at all. And again, this is a traded item. It makes you, is it a present from Whitby? Did somebody go on holiday? Is it something that somebody brought back as a present for these people, a gift for these people? But again, it is very much a status thing. This kind of thing is quite lovely and they're nice to look at, but the stuff that really excited me was the shoes, the fantastic organics. We so rarely get organics preserved in graves because they deteriorate over time, they disappear, they fall apart, and we lose them completely. But in this case here, we had fantastic preservation. And I have to say, this woman's shoes are the things that left me completely open-mouthed. I'm a great fan of Birkenstocks. I wear Birkenstocks. Sorry, it's not an advert, chaps, but I wear Birkenstocks. They are incredibly comfortable. But there's nothing new about cork-soled shoes or cork inner-soled shoes, because that is what we have here. This is a cork midsole to the woman's shoes. She had they're either sheep and goat skin or possibly deer skin shoes, which were padded with felted textiles and feathers, and also with these cork midsoles. There are some such shoes that have been found from London and Vindolanda, but this is the most complete pair of shoes that have been found. These two pairs are the most complete pairs of shoes that have been found in the UK so far. The cork, once again, This has got to be imported. You only get it in Portugal, so it's been imported. These are high status items. The child's shoes, you can see here, these really are complete. You've got complete shoes, so you can see that boot in the ground there. It is a complete boot with its sole, again made of calf skin. This is the first time such a complete pair of shoes have been found, and you can even see the leather laces that we've got in here. The further feathers that we found, we think this is duck down, and this could possibly be related to that pillar that we think might have been under the female's legs. The other find that we had from this, the other organic find we had was less pleasant to think about, but nonetheless is quite helpful from our point of view, and that we had coffin fly pupa that were on the child before burial. Now it only takes hours for coffin fly to sort of get in there. Unfortunately, that's the first thing that happens is flies will land on you and start doing their job probably within about an hour or so of death. Now this might suggest that the child had died before the woman. The other item that we found down at the woman's feet was a silver anklet, which had birch twigs in it. Why the birch twigs were there, we're not sure. The joy of archaeology is that we don't always know all the answers, and it's probably just as well we don't, because we might all be out of a job. But all the time we are finding new things. There's this sort of stuff preserved so rarely that we wouldn't actually know why it was there. Was there something decorative about it, or was it therapeutic? We're not really sure. But this was wrapped around her ankle. So whether the birch twigs are the remnants of some kind of, I don't know, therapeutic bandage that the woman had around her leg, and that's the only thing that has survived of it. We don't really know. And unfortunately, although we have had a lot of work done on the organic remains that came out of the coffin, we haven't found anything that would help us understand that. Moving on to the coffin itself, I've told you a little bit about this already, but you can see it slightly more closely here. It was quite a substantial item. As you can see, that's the base of the sarcophagus is 4,000 kilograms of stone. It's a sandy limestone, which is from Chilmark or Tilsbury. So it's been moved some distance to get here. And that actually is the thing that makes it so expensive in terms of what it is. As it says here, this is possibly a Chilmark stone. It is local to Salisbury, or it could have come from Devizes and Dorchester. So this has moved quite a number of miles, and actually getting something this heavy from the place in which it was made across to where it was buried would have been a very expensive process. So the weight of it, the transport costs, the logistics of it is what makes it expensive. As I said, there was a poor fit. We did have a poor fit on this. I explained about that, but you can see clearly here the lip around here. The other thing of interest about this sarcophagus is the lip area is very neat. The interior of the coffin is very neat, but look how rough the outside of that sarcophagus is. What this tells us to a certain extent is that this part of it was not intended to be seen. This was intended to be viewed, and this is display. A burial of this type would have been about display, so that you could see the dead, you could see them laid out, you could see how comfortable, well, I mean, they did look comfortable. They would have looked comfortable. They would have been together with their finery in this coffin. But this is display. You would have seen it when it was in the ground, not out of the ground. So this would have been covered up by then by a certain amount of backfill, because those shoes we found did not come from down. Those shoes that we found outside the coffin didn't come from down here. they came from a level up here. So this had already been backfilled around this part of the coffin, had been backfilled with chalk, because this grave was cut through the chalk, had been backfilled with chalk before those shoes went in. So the people seeing the burial take place, they wouldn't have seen this part of the coffin at all. As I said, those stones did not fit the lips, they did not fit over the lip. That was back to front. The apsidal end was down here, and that didn't fit at all. So these two stones were actually made for a different sarcophagus, not for this one. As I said, this could have been one of two things that had caused this. It could be that they thought there was going to be, it was a cheap job, or it could be that there was an accident and they had to replace them quite rapidly. And the time to get these in the ground, to get all this in the ground, the logistics of doing it would have been jolly hard work. And just to demonstrate how hard work that would have been, I'm going to show you how we had to get it out. You saw what this looked like originally. We had to excavate all the way around it and get heavy lifting gear in to pull this out of the ground. It really was a major feat of engineering. So how the Romans did it without a 360 machine and a truck, Lord only knows. To quote the Monty Python, what did the Romans ever do for us? Well, I think they did quite a lot of clever engineering before we got, long before we even got there. What was interesting about this, sorry, I'll just go back to this one again. What was interesting about this was after this had happened, this obviously did not sit in isolation. There was a further deposit made over the top of this coffin. Once the burial had taken place and once the grave had been backfilled, a further deposit was made over the top of this, what I've referred to as a memento mori deposit, because not only were inhumation burials taking place on this site, there were also cremation burials taking place, and cremation of individuals was taking place on the site, and within the cemetery precincts, probably somewhere just to the west of this. And we had a deposit over the top of this grave, which was unique to the cemetery, which was not just bits of cremated human bone, but bits of pyre good, bits of items that had been on the pyre. And this was a decorated box of some sort that had decorated bone, worked bone plaque that was put on it. So you had a veneer of worked bone that had been burnt on the pyre, and parts of this were found over this grave and nowhere else. This is likely to have been somebody who was related to the individuals who were in the coffin, and for some reason their cremated remains were scattered over the top. It is unusual. It's unusual to find sarcophagi. Quite often sarcophagi can be contained, can be used to contain lead coffins. This is actually from a different site. There was no sarcophagus in this case, but what we've got here is the remains of a lead coffin without a stone coffin surrounding it, and you can see why a stone coffin might be used, because the lead is so soft it gives way. In this particular case, you probably can't see anything of the occupant, and it took somebody such as myself who understands what the sort of shadows that they're looking at to actually be able to plan what remained of the bone, because actually the bone itself did not survive lifting at all. All you can see here is very dark patches of material. This is the bone, and it really just survived as a shadow in this particular case. So just to show you demonstrate to you the variations in bone preservation you can get. It's not always good skeletons, it's not always in well preserved material, but we can still get an awful lot of information about the occupants from this. I mean, I could tell from this, I think this was an older adult male, but only because I'd actually looked at the skeleton as I was excavating it myself. That's the end of my particular talk. Just to go back very briefly to why those variations in preservation take place. Bone is largely mineral. It has got organics in it, but it will preserve in an alkaline environment, such as we have at Amesbury Down, and most of our skeletal material from Amesbury Down was very, very well preserved because it was in an alkaline environment. The reason we didn't have very good preservation of the bone within the sarcophagus was because it was an acid environment, and the acid will destroy the mineral component of the bone. Most sarcophagi, if you go to museums in continental Europe that have Roman sarcophagi in them, you will notice there is a drainage hole either in the middle or to one end. That drainage hole is there to drain away the body liquors as the body is decomposing. That will make sure that the bone preserves better because you're getting rid of the acid environment. If you leave the body liquors in there, it's acid. That gets rid of the bone, but it preserves the organics. In our case, they'd obviously knew that the stone sarcophagus could be cut out like it was, but they hadn't got that little nuance of the drainage hole. And that's what we didn't have, but it's why we have that fantastic preservation of those wonderful organic shoes, which is, as I say, in many cases, quite a lot of the components there are a first in the UK. So I'd like to thank you for listening. I would like to thank the rest of the team who helped in this, and to our clients, Persimmon and Bloor Homes, who funded the project, and in this case gave us some very practical support with their machinery. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie. That was great. We've had quite a few questions for you from people. So if you're happy, I'll just dive right into those. So first question is about the shoes. Somebody's asked what happened to the shoes after you analysed them. Are they now in a museum? Can you go and see them?
Right. Well, I'm trying to think whether the shoes are there, but anybody who lives in Salisbury, all the finds from this, including the sarcophagus itself, that is actually in Salisbury Museum. I think the sarcophagus is actually, no, they've moved it into it used to be by the door, and I think they've now moved it into one of their display areas. The sarcophagus is there, and if you go in, there is a series of drawers next to the sarcophagus, and that is where the finds are. The shoes themselves, of course, have been preserved. They've been conserved. Because they're organic materials, they have to be within a secure environment because they will start to deteriorate if they get air to them. But you can certainly go and see most of the material, apart from the bone. Unfortunately, the human bone is not very well preserved and is not on display, but you can see those in Salisbury Museum.
Great. And just about the kind of location of the burials. So these being quite kind of isolated graves, were they buried near the cemeteries where they were found on purpose, to kind of keep that as an ongoing place for burials, or was it mainly coincidental that they happened to be buried there?
No, I think they do all form part of a like I say, an area to the. Like I say, we had the area to the north of that Wessex linear ditch, which is where the living were. That area to the south definitely seems to be one in which it was recognised the dead were placed. So the thing about the Roman period, what they tended to do was they wanted to be able to see where their dead were. They had to be liminalised, they had to be distanced from the living, but you wanted to be able to see where they were. So the cemeteries are all within a view shed. You can see the cemeteries from the southwest very clearly. Or you could do before we actually, you would have been able to see them very, very clearly. It's a mileage of view shed to be able to see where the cemeteries were. But you could also see them from the other side of that Wessex linear ditch, and that seems to have been a marker that the Romans themselves have used. They did quite often recognise the presence of people in the landscape before them, and they would use their features, their monuments, in order to place their own dead next to.
And do you think, is that mainly for convenience, or do you think, is there a kind of spiritual element to that as well?
I suspect there's a bit of both here. There it would be convenient because it was easy to get to from the town, from the little town that we know was up there. But I think recognizing the existence of ancestral presence within a landscape is very important at all times. We know the Anglo-Saxons quite often reused prehistoric barrows as a focus in which to bury the dead. And of course, what I didn't show you here was there is quite a big prehistoric presence in this part of the site as well. But the prehistoric burial remains go to either side of that Wessex linear ditch. So the ditch is quite important as a focus for them. But I think they would have known that that area was used to bury the dead in at a previous time, and it would have been recognised as a sort of, like I say, almost a spiritual zone as well as a zone for the dead to be in.
Interesting. Um, and just in terms of kind of identifying and dating the skeletons, when it comes to degenerative aging, somebody's asked, can it be tough sometimes based on the life the individual might have lived? So, for example, if they'd lived a life that included a lot more hard work, more the kind of degeneration would have been kind of significantly more, and therefore would that be harder for you to kind of assess?
Well, you're quite right that people do, and I use this expression loosely, degenerate at different rates, and they can be affected by lots of things. A lot of this is down to genetics. If, say, for instance, you were to put, I don't know, 10 people of 60 in a row next to each other, they will probably not all look the same age, because it depends on your genetics. Some people are prone to some of those diseases, the degenerative diseases, which is predominantly arthritic in nature. I can guarantee to you everybody over the age of 40 will have some arthritic changes somewhere in their body, but they probably won't know they're there, in their skeleton, but they won't know they're there. You don't feel it till later on. Some of it is down to environmental influences, quite right. You can, if you are doing a lot of heavy lifting and very hefty carrying of things, then that will certainly affect your spine quite badly. And we do find that there's differences in the degenerative changes to a skeleton, particularly between males and females. They get affected in different areas of the skeleton, probably due to the kind of work that they were engaged in. Women tend to get changes in their neck far more than men. And men get them in their lower spine because they're probably doing heavier lifting of things. But the kind of changes that we used, you will look at tooth wear patterns, which are really quite good to work on. So how quickly your teeth wear, and you develop a system per assemblage, as it were, by looking at the younger individuals and seeing how their teeth wear, because of course that's partly dependent on your diet. So there will be variations on your diet. So we developed specific assemblage related tooth wear pattern codes that we can work with. Other changes are in parts of your hip bones, which is not necessarily related to the work that you do. It's just we find there are degenerative changes that take place usually in sort of 5 to 10 year blocks. So you can't age people as closely. When you get into the old, I mean, there's a lot of people I can just say, oh, they're over 45, or they're between 45 and 60, or they're between 60 and 65. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you might be able to do that. But they're much broader age bands when you get into the older adult groups, because as the questioner quite rightly said, there can be lots of variables that we can't account for that might give us a clue. But we also get changes to the muscle, where the muscles attached to the bone, that will tell you whether somebody has done lots of heavy lifting and things. Because if you are doing lots of heavy lifting and lots of heavy work, you have to develop heavy musculature to support that work, and that also affects the bone, because where the muscles attach to the bones, you will get changes. We'll get new bone and extra bone building up there, because it has to sort of support that musculature, that heavy musculature. So we can get some idea whether somebody's done lots of hard work during their life, Your
Hmm.
bone is a plastic substance. It is constantly resorbing and reforming. And if
Yeah.
you do weightlifting, I can tell you've done weightlifting because of the muscle attachments and the sites at which
Yeah.
the muscle attach.
Yeah. It all leaves its mark.
Yeah,
Um,
everything leaves its mark. Yeah.
yeah. And just a question about the sarcophagus itself. So if the lid had fitted completely, would you have expected the preservation to be significantly different to what you found?
No, not in this case, because the main point we had here was the fact that there was no drainage hole.
Mm,
Um, a lot of the changes that take place to the skeleton, what we call taphonomic changes, take place quite soon, within the first sort of couple of decades after death.
mm,
So and this was in a very, very stable environment. No soil had got in, even with the lids not fitting properly. If you notice, we took taking no soil out of there. The only stuff
mm,
that had got in were those little bits of chalk that had dropped in down the side when we started excavating the grave fill. It had just trickled in.
mhm,
So there was no soil in there. Um, it had done quite a good job as far as that goes, and because it was quite deep in the ground and it was sealed in a way from the soil, then you'd got quite a stable environment. The problem we had was there was no drainage hole, so the body liquors, as the body decomposed. Sorry, this sounds really horrible, but it is after lunch, isn't it? Um, as the body decomposed, it would have been laying in the body liquors. They couldn't drain away, so they basically were laying in an acid environment, and they lay in there for that would have been for sufficient length of time to cause the damage to the bone, because the bone was not very well preserved. It was good enough for me to be able to work with, but it wasn't particularly well preserved. But
mm,
also enabled the organics to survive. So it probably wouldn't have made that much difference if it had a complete lid. It would have looked
mm.
neater. That's all.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and were there any signs of cause of death? So I know you did say that the child might have passed away before the mother, but maybe not a significant amount of time before. Is there anything that might show how they actually died?
Unfortunately not. Most of the time with archaeological remains, what we're looking at is what people suffered from rather than from what they died from, unless it's an acute, something really acute, like an injury. Because
Yeah.
most diseases that would have killed people would have been acute diseases. They'd have been infections. And with an infection, I mean, if you had a meningeal infection, a brain infection, for instance, you might have enough time for changes to develop on the inside of the skull, because
Mhm.
because the brain is so close and the meninges is so close, and that kind of thing does tend to be a cause of death. If it's
Mm,
active, if you can see those active changes, you get little bits of new bone forming on the bone itself in reaction to infection. If it's somewhere like the skull, sometimes you can tell that would have probably been uh, significant in terms of death. But most of the time, people would have died of infections that work so quickly, and they would have been in the soft tissues, it would not have had time to affect the bone.
mm,
What we tend to forget, and I always say to people, what kind of diseases did you have when you were a child? I mean,
mm,
I know for instance, me and my three brothers would all have been dead by the time we were 12 if it wasn't for modern medicine, because we all had acute appendicitis. And in fact,
mhm,
one of my brothers very nearly did die. Because we had the advantage of modern medicine, we didn't,
mm,
thankfully. But that would have left no mark on our bone at all. So we'd have all been dead
mm,
then. If you think, if a child gets an infection of some sort, if they get measles, all these things that don't kill people now, certainly in the UK, they do in other places, measles, chickenpox, scarlatina, all this kind of particularly childhood diseases. Um,
mm,
if a child gets those and it hasn't got modern medicine, then it doesn't always stand much of a chance. And who nurses a child when they're ill? A
mm,
mother
mm,
usually, or a grandmother, or an older sister, or something like that. So the chances are that this was some kind of infectious disease. The woman would have been nursing the child and would have caught the disease as well, and that would probably be why they're both buried together at the same time. Unless I know it's a bit of a broad thing, but I normally say unless somebody's had their head chopped off, I can't normally tell what they died of.
yeah.
But it's not quite that simple. We can see what people suffered from. There are some cancers which, if they take a long time to develop, will leave a scar on the bone, and you can guarantee if it's got that bad on the bone, then it will have killed the person. It would have been their cause of death in the long run.
Yeah, yeah.
But not in
And
this
as you've
case.
demonstrated, you can make a kind of an educated guess about, from our own experience, and our
Yeah,
own exactly
yeah.
what might have happened. So this question is, I think what they're asking is about where the sarcophagus would have been made. So whether they'd have made it kind of on or nearby the site where the burial happened.
Yeah, it's a tough one. That I think bearing in mind the weight of this coffin, it would have been, they'd probably at least have done a rough out of it to transport it, because if you hadn't roughed out the inside, then you've got an even heavier piece of stone. And it was heavy enough as it was. Like I said, it was 4,000 kilograms just to move as it was.
Mm,
So I think they would at least have done a rough out. We had no materials on the surface that would suggest to us that they did anything on site. But of course, if they did that on the surface, if they did some finishing off on the surface,
mhm,
then that's all been ploughed away years and years ago. We wouldn't, this field's been cultivated. There's been ploughing here, and also we know there's been probably at least, I would say, 30 centimeters, 30, 40 centimeters horizontal truncation of the
mhm,
surface here over time since the Roman period. So, anything that was on the surface as it was would have long gone, long gone.
mm, mm,
But I think it likely that they would have done a certain amount of work on it before they transported it, simply because of the weight, the additional weight having that inside that stone inside would be.
mhm,
I find the capstones absolutely intriguing because, like I
mm,
say, they did not fit this coffin, and there are only two potential reasons for this. One is that they'd made the capstone,
mhm,
brought it over here, and then broke the flipping thing before they managed to get it in position into a point. Then they had to do a rush job and go and get something that they had in the yard and just bring them over to use. Or secondly, it was oh well, it doesn't fit, but nobody will see it, because by the time the capstone's gone on, they'll all have gone home. The mourners
mm,
would have left. This would have been something that was done afterwards, and they might have just said, "Look, I can let you have them a bit cheaper. They don't fit, but they'll do the job. So, we can we'll do a deal on it. All right, nobody's going to see
mm,
it." And they put those on, and but this is human, and these people,
mm,
we forget at our peril that we are talking about people who moved around and were, they had the same kind of thoughts that we did. They did
mm,
wheeler dealing the same as people do now. And this
mm,
is what makes archaeology so fantastic. They wouldn't have written about this. This wouldn't have been written in any of the sort of official reports you get, that because it didn't quite fit. The rules and
mm,
regulations are, oh, it would have to be done like this and done like this, and somebody does a deal when it's kind of an under the table job. They're not going to tell anybody and write it down. So, but this is where archaeology comes in and actually
mm.
informs the history.
Yeah,
Not
and gives that
everything
human
gets
element.
exactly, and that for me is what makes archaeology so fascinating, because it's what I always call a handshake through time.
Mm.
That's what you do. I mean, we can't handshake at the moment. You'd have to do a hand wave, wouldn't you? But it's a handshake. It's a handshake through time to people. And
Yeah,
like I said, it was also that it was done for display. This
yeah.
was meant to be seen, and the picture you can see here, that's what well, they wouldn't see me there obviously, but that's the level at which the mourners would have seen that coffin. So you can see what I mean about the sides not mattering. They'd
Mm,
already backfilled it around the sides of the coffin to the bit that people would see.
mm, mm. Interesting. And this kind of leads to the next question. So this lady's just asking, you did touch on the fact that there are kind of little concentrations of sarcophagus burials around the country, and the ones that you've come across, or are the ones that have been found so far, are they all purely kind of status burials, or is there any indication that they also may possibly have been used for kind of more common kind of burials?
By and large, I think the ones that we were fine tend to suggest the materials that come out of them tend to suggest their high status for a start off. I mean,
Hmm.
you might have seen some years ago there was a fantastic find in Roman London, and I think the video might even still be available online that the Museum of London did, and they'd got amazing. Not that I'm jealous or anything, but they had amazing preservation, both of the bone and of the organic materials they had in there, and they've got lots of. I mean, we had materials from this that suggested there was things like fern and bracken that might have been across the base of maybe acting as a lining, and oddly
Mm.
enough a walnut. We're not quite sure about the walnut, because the walnuts did not grow here. They did not grow they didn't grow them in the UK. Sorry, they didn't grow them in Britain, should I say? So that again suggests that something brought over, but it's the logistics and the expense of cutting the stone sarcophagus and transporting it to the place of burial. Because these sarcophagi, London doesn't have, for instance, there's quite a number in London. They don't
Mm.
have limestone in London. It doesn't. So it would have been imported, and that would have been the expense. So as
Mm.
far as we know, as far as we can tell so far, they would be high status. But of course, part of the problem is that a lot of the ones that we've got evidence for are now being used as water troughs and plant displays because
Mm.
they were found by antiquarians. And what they didn't always do is record things in the way that we did. They didn't, it was variable. Sometimes they
Mm.
recorded it quite nicely. Sometimes, oh, we found a sarcophagus, there was nothing in it. But what they would have missed would be maybe the organic materials that we found, because they wouldn't be able to do the kind of analyses that we can do now. But as far as we
Mm.
know, it's high status
Yeah.
and usually
Okay.
urban, predominantly urban.
Interesting. Um, and last question. So, somebody's asked, although the bone is ill preserved, could DNA analysis be done to determine disease and lineage?
Well, DNA analysis could be done, but technically it could be done, but unfortunately, in this case, the bone preservation certainly would not have DNA preserved within it.
Mhm.
We do DNA, and we're starting to do a little bit more DNA analysis now than we used to do, because there's actually no commercial outlet in the UK currently that will do DNA analysis. But I've just been involved recently with doing some on a Roman site down in Somerset, but we're having to send it to Sweden to have it done.
Mm.
You do need good bone preservation to get DNA. And the problem is what they do when they're doing the DNA analysis, they don't use the tooth crowns, which is what I've got preserved, and that's why I could do the peptide analysis, because it's the tooth enamel that they do the peptide analysis on for doing the sexing of
Okay.
the child. But if they're doing DNA analysis, they use the tooth roots, and the tooth roots preservation was also very, very poor. Now, that does not mean that at some point in the future they might advance the technique of ancient DNA analysis to be able this to be done. So there's always hope at some point in the future, because obviously what would be nice to know whether they directly were related. I mean, I'm assuming they're going to be mother and child, or
Hmm.
certainly not grandmother and child, because it's the wrong the woman's the wrong age, but it could be sister and brother. It would be nice to be able to know whether that was a first and second generation link, because of course one of the things that did sometimes happen within a community,
Mm.
close-knit communities, then you could have an auntie in inverted commas. I mean,
Mm.
I get called auntie by my godchildren,
Mm.
but I'm not directly related to them. So there could be something like that happened. And sometimes it looks likely that we know from written accounts, from later periods, that women and children, or children, would often be buried with an adult who was from their community but not necessarily their direct relative, because you don't always want to bury a child alone. So it'd be nice to be able to do those tests. um, you can pick up some diseases. Certain types of diseases will pick up in the DNA, but ancient DNA, I don't know how familiar people are with this, but unlike modern DNA, when the what we call the SNPs and the that you can see now, a SNP, it looks like a barcode. That's the best way of describing it. It looks like a barcode. So it's got lots of those lines in there, and some are thicker than others, some are thinner, and that's how you will identify certain things within them. Unfortunately, with ancient DNA, you get gaps in the barcode, which is why you have to do lots of samples so that you
Hmm.
can compare them in the hope that a bit of the line will preserve in some of the snips that isn't in others. Where you've
Okay.
got poor preservation like we've got here, there would be so much missing that you would be limited as to what you could tell with them. So I have my fingers crossed for the future that this will become
Yeah.
more accessible. The material is there to still work on, and that is as important, is preserving that material for future analyses that can be done. I would not want to do a piece of destructive analysis on something that just because it might work.
Yeah.
I have to have an eye to the future and be fairly confident that we are doing the best we can with the material available while
Mhm.
still leaving material for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, as you say, is the beauty of it. It's an ongoing story that evolves as we get new technology and things like
Yeah,
that, and we can
yeah,
work more and uncover
yeah,
more about
yeah.
this.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
exactly. I mean, this thing, just going briefly back to the peptide analysis, this where you take all they do is put it's almost like just taking a swab on the
mm,
tooth enamel, which will help you sex an individual. Um, that's been developed over the last 2 years, just the last 2 years. And the vital importance of that is we cannot do this, we cannot sex easily children, certainly children under the age of 15. It's very difficult. Sometimes we can give a suggestion, but it's not very reliable. And if you think how many children we've got, and now with this technique, we will be able to sex them, which will help us
mm,
understand population dynamics, cultural activity, so much easier. And that is
mm.
just in the last 2 years that that's been developed.
Yeah,
That just
amazing.
demonstrates to you how important it is. New techniques are constantly being developed that will help
Mm.
us gain more information about people in the past.
Exciting stuff. Well, that is all of the questions that we've had. So, thank you very much for everybody for those questions, and thank you very much, Jackie, for answering, and also a really really interesting talk. I would just say to everybody that's still on the line that you can find out more information about this site on our website, which is www.wessexarch.co.uk. You can also There's also a really lovely video which shows you exactly how the sarcophagus was kind of taken out of the ground and shows that big truck lifting it out. So you can watch that on our YouTube. So if you just search for Wessex Archaeology on YouTube, you should be able to search for that. And I'd also encourage you to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all at Wessex Arch, ARCH. But that's all for today. Thank you very much. Tune in next week for our next webinar. We'll be sharing the details on our social media pages. But thanks, Jackie, very much.
Okay, have a good day, everybody. Take care.